August 26th, 1071. By noon on that day, the Roman Emperor of the East, commander of the largest, most sophisticated empire in the medieval world, was sitting in a tent as a prisoner of war. He had not been captured by overwhelming numbers. He had not been betrayed by cowardice. He had ridden into that field at the head of one of the most powerful armies the Byzantine Empire had assembled in a generation. Cavalry infantry, Varangian guards, mercenaries from a dozen nations. And in the space of a single afternoon on a sun-baked plain in the highlands of eastern Anatolia, everything had come apart. His name was Romanos IV Diogenes. And the man who sat across from him in that tent, the man who had just shattered the eastern frontier of a civilization that had endured for 7 centuries, received him not with cruelty, but with something far more disorienting courtesy. Alp Arslan, Sultan of the great Seljuk Empire, pressed the Byzantine emperor's face to the ground in the ritual of submission. He asked him through translators what he would have done had their positions been reversed. Romanos replied honestly that he would have beaten him, paraded him in chains through the streets of Constantinople, and likely put him to death. Alp Arslan considered this for a moment, and then he negotiated a ransom, helped the emperor to his feet, and sent him home. What he had already taken, however, could not be given back. The Battle of Manzikert did not just defeat a Byzantine army, it cracked open a door into the heartland of the Byzantine world. The great Anatolian plateau that had fed the empire's armies and filled its treasury for centuries. And through that door, over the decades and generations that followed, came a wave of Turkic settlers, nomadic clans, and new rulers that would permanently and irreversibly transform the ethnic, religious, and political character of the land we now call Turkey. The Byzantine Empire would survive Manzikert by nearly 400 years. But it never recovered. Not really. What happened on that August afternoon in eastern Anatolia set in motion a chain of events that would end with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the birth of the Ottoman Empire, and a geopolitical transformation whose effects we are still living with today. This is the story of how one battle changed the shape of a continent, and how it very nearly did not have to happen at all. To understand Manzikert, you need to understand what the Byzantine Empire was and what it had been pretending to be. In 1071, Byzantium was on the surface still formidable. Its capital, Constantinople, was the largest, wealthiest, and most cosmopolitan city in the Christian world. A metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, ringed by triple walls that had repelled Huns, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Russian raiders over the span of 7 centuries. Its navy controlled the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. Its bureaucracy administered a state stretching from the Balkans through Greece and across the vast interior of Anatolia, reaching all the way to the borders of Armenia and the Caucasus. The empire was ancient. It was experienced. It had seen enemies rise and fall across its long history and had outlasted all of them. But beneath the gold mosaics and the marble colonnades, the empire was sick. The sickness had been growing for decades, rooted in a structural conflict that Byzantine society had never fully resolved: the conflict between the civilian aristocracy of Constantinople, the educated, cultured, politically sophisticated families who staffed the imperial court and the administrative apparatus, and the military aristocracy of the provinces, the landed frontier families who raised armies, commanded soldiers, and held the border against an increasingly aggressive outside world. For most of Byzantine history, these two groups had been held in an uneasy but functional balance. But in the decades before Manzikert, the civilian aristocracy had won decisively. A series of emperors drawn from the court circles of Constantinople had systematically weakened the military frontier system, reducing the professional frontier armies known as the tagmata, cutting the salaries of border soldiers, replacing them with cheaper mercenaries of increasingly uncertain loyalty. The logic had been financial and political standing. Professional armies cost money that the court preferred to spend on itself, and powerful military commanders stationed in the provinces were inherently dangerous to emperors who sat in palaces far away. The result was a frontier that looked intact on maps, but was in reality growing hollow, a shell of a defensive system held together by institutional memory and habit rather than actual strength. Into this hollowness came the Seljuks. The Seljuk Turks were in the 11th century something genuinely new in the history of the Middle East, a force that had materialized seemingly from nowhere with terrifying speed and coherence. They were not the first Turkic people to press against Byzantine borders. The region had known Turkic raiders and settlers for generations, but the Seljuks were something categorically different. A recently unified confederation of nomadic clans from the Central Asian steppes who had converted to Sunni Islam with the fervor of the newly devout, and who had, in the space of a single generation, built an empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia, across Persia, through Iraq, all the way to the borders of Egypt. Their military system was built entirely around highly mobile cavalry, horse archers of extraordinary skill, men who had been riding since they could walk, who could shoot accurately at full gallop change direction faster than any infantry formation could track and sustain campaigns of movement across distances that would have broken most medieval armies. They were not an army of siege engineers, supply trains, and garrison soldiers. They were an army of speed of feint and pursuit of raids that materialized from nowhere, struck hard, and vanished before any organized response could be mounted. Their sultan, in 1071, was a man of genuine military genius. His name was Alp Arslan in the Turkic tradition, a descriptive name meaning lion hero, and he had earned every syllable of it. He had reunified the Seljuk Confederation after a period of dangerous dynastic instability. He had defeated the Fatimid Caliphate in Syria. He had extended Seljuk authority across an arc of territory that made his empire one of the most powerful states in the world. He was intelligent, decisive, personally brave, and as the events at Manzikert would show, strategically flexible in a way that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. In the early months of 1071, Alp Arslan was not, historians generally believe, primarily focused on Byzantium. His attention was directed south and west toward Egypt and the Fatimid Caliphate, consolidating Seljuk dominance over the Islamic heartland. The Seljuk raids into Byzantine Anatolia that had been intensifying for the past decade were largely the work of semi-independent Turkic clan leaders operating on the fringes of Seljuk authority, not directed campaigns of imperial conquest. The man who changed this calculus, who forced Alp Arslan to turn his army north and engage Byzantium directly, was the Byzantine Emperor himself, Romanos IV. Diogenes was not a native emperor. He was a military commander from the Cappadocian frontier aristocracy, the very class that the civilian court had been trying to sideline for decades, who had married the widowed empress Eudokia Makrembolitisa in 1068 and used that marriage to seize the imperial throne. He was, by most historical accounts, brave, energetic, forthright to the point of bluntness, and sincerely committed to reversing the military decay that had left the eastern frontier so dangerously exposed. He understood what his predecessors had refused to understand, that the Seljuk raiding was not a temporary nuisance to be managed through diplomacy and occasional punitive expeditions, but a structural threat that would, if left unaddressed, eventually transform from raiding into settlement, and from settlement into permanent dispossession. The only answer was military rebuilding the frontier forces, reclaiming lost territory, and establishing Byzantine power in the east on terms that the Seljuks would have to respect. In the 3 years before Manzikert, Romanos had personally led 3 major campaigns into eastern Anatolia, recovering some lost ground, and demonstrating at least that Byzantine armies could still operate in the field. He was building a reputation as a warrior emperor, rebuilding morale in the military, and gradually establishing the political legitimacy that his coup by marriage had denied him. But he was also making enemies, powerful, implacable, strategically positioned enemies. The civilian aristocracy of Constantinople, particularly the Ducas family, one of the great dynasties of Byzantine court life, had never accepted Romanos as legitimate. They had tolerated him as long as he seemed useful, but the military campaigns were changing the political balance in ways they found threatening. A successful campaign in the east would make Romanos politically unassailable, popular with the army, popular with the frontier provinces, capable of sidelining the court aristocracy he had always represented a threat to. John Ducas, the Caesar, and uncle of the young co-emperor Michael Ducas, understood this calculation with perfect clarity. He had every reason to want the campaign to fail, and he placed a member of his family, Andronikos Ducas, in command of the Byzantine rear guard. This is the context in which the army of 1071 was assembled and marched east. Romanos was not just fighting the Seljuks. He was fighting simultaneously for military success against an external threat and political survival against enemies at home who were, even as he marched, laying the groundwork for his removal. The Byzantine army that gathered in the spring of 1071 and began its eastward march through Anatolia toward the Armenian highlands was large and at least superficially impressive. Historical sources vary wildly in their estimates, as they invariably do with medieval armies. But the consensus of modern scholarship puts the Byzantine force somewhere between 40 and perhaps 60,000 men, a substantial force that included the elite Varangian Guard, Scandinavian, and Anglo-Saxon warriors serving as the emperor's personal household troops, heavy cavalry units from across the empire, Armenian and Georgian auxiliaries who knew the local terrain, and a significant contingent of Frankish and Norman mercenaries whose fighting quality was high but whose loyalty was calibrated to their contracts. Beneath its size, the army had serious vulnerabilities. The mercenary contingents were inherently unreliable. Their loyalties were contractual rather than emotional. Their commanders had their own professional interests, and the Byzantine financial crisis of the preceding decades had made the state a sometimes unreliable paymaster. The different national contingents had different fighting styles, different chain of command expectations, and different cultures. Communication across such a diverse force required exceptional staff work and clear, respected authority. Romanos had neither insufficient quantity. He had also made a decision that would prove consequential. He divided his army, sending a substantial force under the general Joseph Tarchanaiotes, possibly as many as a third of his total strength toward Lake Van, on a separate axis of advance, while he continued toward Manzikert with the main body. The intention was to cover more ground and cut off possible Seljuk escape routes. The effect was to weaken the force at the critical point. When Alp Arslan received intelligence that a major Byzantine army was moving through eastern Anatolia, with Romanos personally in command, he made a decision that revealed the quality of his strategic thinking. He abandoned his Syrian campaign entirely. He turned his army north, and he moved with a speed that caught Byzantine intelligence completely by surprise, materializing in the hills around Manzikert, before Romanos had any clear picture of where the main Seljuk force actually was. The Seljuk army that appeared was smaller than the Byzantine force. Most estimates place it at 20 to 30,000 cavalry, a significant numerical disadvantage. But Alp Arslan was not planning to fight a battle of attrition. He was planning to fight the kind of battle that Seljuk cavalry was uniquely equipped to win. In the days before the main engagement, he tested the Byzantine defenses. Seljuk cavalry conducted raids against Byzantine foraging parties and supply lines, probing for weaknesses. In one of these preliminary engagements, a Byzantine force under the general Basileus sent out to secure provisions was caught and destroyed. Basileus himself was captured. The news reached Romanos on the eve of his main advance and delivered an early blow to Byzantine confidence. On the morning of August 26, 1071, Romanos IV Diogenes formed his army into battle order and advanced toward the Seljuk position on the plain outside the town of Manzikert in the eastern Anatolian highlands near Lake Van. The Byzantine formation followed standard doctrine, heavy cavalry on the flanks to protect against encirclement infantry in the center. As the main mass a forward screen of lighter troops and a substantial rear guard held in reserve commanded by Andronikos Doukas. The battle opened with Byzantine advances and Seljuk withdrawals. The Seljuk horse archers fell back before the Byzantine cavalry, maintaining distance, loosing arrows as they retreated, drawing the Byzantine units forward across the plain. The Byzantine infantry, heavier and slower, struggled to maintain contact with the faster cavalry ahead of them. As the morning became afternoon, the Byzantine formation began to stretch, the faster units pulling ahead, the slower ones falling behind, the cohesion of the line beginning to fray at its edges. This was not an accident, it was the plan. The Seljuk feigned retreat was one of the most practiced and lethal tactical maneuvers in the nomadic military tradition. It worked by exploiting the natural instinct of troops who believed they were winning to pursue aggressively, to press forward, break formation, and chase an enemy that appeared to be breaking. The retreating force would draw the pursuers forward until they were exhausted, separated from support, and vulnerable, at which point the retreat would reverse and become a devastating counterattack. For hours through the afternoon, the dance continued across the plain. Romanos pressed forward. The Seljuks withdrew. The Byzantine lines stretched. No decisive engagement came. As the afternoon light began to shift and the shadows lengthened across the Anatolian plain, Romanos faced the decision that he had been dreading. He had advanced far from his camp. His lines were extended. His troops were tired. The day was failing. He had not achieved the decisive engagement he had come for, and he could not remain in that position through the night. He gave the order that no medieval commander wanted to give in contact with a mobile enemy: turn around. March back to camp. Maintain formation. Reversing a medieval army in the field while in contact with a highly mobile enemy that had been waiting for exactly this moment was among the most dangerous maneuvers that existed in warfare. It required perfect coordination across a front of miles, perfect discipline in every unit simultaneously, and perfect communication through a command structure that was already under stress. If any element broke formation during the turn, the whole would unravel. And then Andronikos Doukas took his rear guard and marched away. He did not hold his position to cover the withdrawal. He did not anchor a defensive line to slow any pursuit. He turned the rear guard around, away from the approaching Seljuks, away from the main army that was beginning its difficult reversal, and marched back toward camp. Whether this was calculated, deliberate betrayal ordered, or at least authorized by the Doukas faction that had been working against Romanos for 3 years, or whether it was a misread of orders, a failure of nerve, or some catastrophic combination of confusion and bad judgment, historians have argued for nearly 1,000 years, without reaching consensus. The sources closest to the event suggest deliberate sabotage. The most charitable interpretation is military incompetence on a catastrophic scale. What is beyond argument is the effect. The buffer between the main army and the pursuing Seljuks simply disappeared. Alp Arslan, watching from the Seljuk lines, saw the Byzantine formation begin to turn. He saw the rear guard peel away, and he gave the order that he had been waiting hours to give. The Seljuk cavalry attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, a hammer blow from the rear, and both flanks against a force caught mid-reversal, its attention forward, its formation disrupted, its covering force gone. The Byzantine units that had been advancing became units trying to turn, then units trying to run. Unit cohesion collapsed. The organized withdrawal became a rout. Romanos IV Diogenes fought. Whatever his failures of generalship, whatever the political miscalculations that had brought him to that field, he did not run. He was wounded multiple times. He was unhorsed. He fought on foot. And eventually, surrounded by Seljuk cavalry, he was captured the Byzantine Emperor heir to 7 centuries of Roman tradition, taken prisoner on an Anatolian plain by a Turkic sultan who had materialized from the steppe a generation earlier. The aftermath unfolded in 2 separate tragedies. The first was in the Seljuk camp, and it was surprisingly dignified. Alp Arslan negotiated terms, a ransom of 1.5 million gold pieces, the release of Byzantine prisoners, a proposed military alliance. He treated Romanos with the respect due a defeated monarch. The emperor was to go home. The agreement, if honored, might have preserved something of the Byzantine position in the east. The second tragedy was in Constantinople, and it was not dignified at all. The Dukas faction had been moving against Romanos even before news of Manzikert reached the capital. Michael Dukas was proclaimed sole emperor. When Romanos returned to Byzantine territory and tried to continue ruling, he was met not by subjects, but by armies sent to capture him. He fought, lost, surrendered, was captured, and was blinded, the Byzantine method of politically neutralizing a rival without technically executing him. The blinding was performed brutally. Romanos died of his wounds within months, abandoned in a monastery on the island of Proti. The ransom was never paid, the treaty was never honored, and the frontier was left open. The Seljuks had not planned to occupy Anatolia. Alp Arslan's goals had been strategic, neutralizing the Byzantine threat to his flank while he focused on the Islamic world. He had not sent administrators to govern Anatolian cities or generals to garrison Anatolian towns. He had simply removed the military force that had been holding the line. Into the vacuum that Byzantine political collapse created, Turkic clan leaders moved with their people. Not as conquerors with imperial orders, but as settlers following opportunity clans seeking pasture, water, land safety. The Byzantine administrative system, already weakened by decades of neglect, and now further paralyzed by civil war, could not stop them. Towns that had been Greek-speaking and Orthodox Christian for a millennium, gradually over generations, became Turkish-speaking and Muslim, not always through violence, but through the slow, profound arithmetic of demographic transformation. The Byzantines fought back. They launched campaigns, hired Turkic mercenaries against other Turkic settlers, appealed to the West for help. The First Crusade, launched in 1095, was partly a response to Byzantine appeals, and the Crusaders passing through Anatolia on the way to Jerusalem did temporarily recover some territory. But they were not staying, and the underlying demographic reality was not reversible. A generation after Manzikert, the Seljuks had established the Sultanate of Rum. The Sultanate of Rome so named because the Seljuks themselves recognized they now ruled former Roman territory, with its capital at Nicaea, less than 100 miles from Constantinople itself. The geographical heart of the Byzantine Empire was being transformed into something else. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, a catastrophe inflicted not by Muslims, but by fellow Christians, Venetian merchants, and Frankish knights who had been diverted from their original mission. The city was looted, the empire fractured, and the restored Byzantine state that emerged in 1261 was a pale shadow of what had existed before. It controlled Constantinople and little else. The Anatolian heartland was gone. In the early 14th century, in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, a small Turkic principality, under a leader named Osman, began to expand. The Osmanli, the Ottomans, built their empire on the ruins of Byzantine weakness with methodical precision. Bursa, Nicaea, the Balkans, Adrianople, a ring of territory around a Constantinople that had become an island of Byzantine survival in an Ottoman sea. On May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, rode through the gates of a city that had been the heart of the Roman world for 11 centuries. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, Palaiologos, had died fighting on the walls that morning, refusing evacuation, refusing surrender. His body was never identified. From Manzikert in 1071 to Constantinople in 1453. 382 years. But the thread is unbroken. The crack opened by Alp Arslan's cavalry on that August afternoon in 1071 is the same crack through which the Ottomans walked 4 centuries later. The Republic of Turkey, 85 million people, the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, a nation that sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, is in one of the most direct historical lineages in the medieval world, the product of what began at Manzikert. The transformation of Anatolia was not instantaneous, was not without complexity, involved centuries of cultural blending, religious coexistence, and periodic violence. But the starting point, the moment when the door was opened, was August 26, 1071. Alp Arslan died the following year, 1072, not in battle, but killed by a captured fortress commander during his own execution ceremony. He had dismissed his guards to execute the man himself. The prisoner seized the opportunity. The greatest sultan of the Seljuk dynasty, the man who had humiliated Byzantium and set the Middle East on a new historical trajectory, died at approximately 42 years old because he was too proud to let someone else do a job he wanted to do himself. His empire began fragmenting almost immediately. The Seljuk Confederation was held together by personal authority as much as institutional structure, and without Alp Arslan, the centrifugal forces reasserted themselves. The empire broke into competing sultanates. The vacuum at the center created exactly the conditions in which smaller, more focused powers, the Ottomans among them, could eventually grow. The man who changed the world never saw what he had changed it into. This too is a recurring pattern in history. Romanos IV, Diogenes, the man who had tried to save the Byzantine East and paid for the attempt with his throne, his eyesight, and his life, died perhaps 6 months after the battle that had made him famous. He had diagnosed the problem correctly. He had tried to solve it. He had been destroyed not by the enemy he was fighting, but by the political system he was fighting for. This is perhaps the deepest lesson embedded in the story of Manzikert, and it is a lesson that history has offered in variant forms across many centuries and many civilizations. Institutions are rarely destroyed by enemies more powerful than themselves. They are more often weakened from within their defenses, hollowed out by factional interest. Their best responses to external threats undermined by internal actors who fear those responses more than they fear the threat itself. The Ducas family saved its position in Constantinople. It succeeded in destroying Romanos, and then it presided over the irreversible collapse of the military frontier it had spent decades undermining. We study Manzikert not because it is obscure, though it is less well known in the West than it deserves to be, but because it is one of the clearest examples in medieval history of how a civilization's fate can hinge on a single afternoon on a reversal order given under pressure on a general who chose to march away instead of stand. The Byzantine Empire did not fall at Manzikert. It fell across 4 centuries, decision by decision, crisis by crisis, in response to a structural vulnerability that Manzikert had exposed and deepened. But Manzikert is where the vulnerability became irreversible. It is where the door opened, and the world that stands on the other side of that door, the Turkey of today, the Islamic civilization of Anatolia, the Ottoman legacy that shaped the entire Middle East, is the world that door let in. If this story of a captured emperor and a sultan who sent him home, of a rear guard that turned and walked away, of a civilization that survived a battle and lost a continent, reached you today and made the past feel real and present and urgent, then subscribe to this channel. Because we are only beginning to dig into the battles and decisions that made the world we live in. The turning points that most people have never heard of, the moments when everything changed.